Again, Jesse St. Cyr, the owner of St. Cyr Consulting, which is a management consulting company focused on HR and D&I solutions and strategies, leadership development, and management training. And the Leadership at Work series is a three-part leadership training program that I've created. And the idea there was to provide leaders with the tools they needed to move from individual contributor roles to organizational leadership roles. And part of the series is the succession planning aspect of leadership, which I think is critical. And given the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, and a number of surveys that have come out about the transitions that are happening in the workplace, I thought it was very important to bring to you Tim Breene, who has an extraordinary background in leadership, and he has served as a CEO for about 20 years in various positions. And he is also the co-author of Jumping the S-Curve, How to Beat the Growth Cycle, Get on Top and Stay There. And if you've received the bio, you would have seen a number of articles that I also included, and I've had a chance to read them. I promise you, if you are leading an organization, you definitely want to read it and learn how to pivot and not stay stagnant and grow in this very evolving and changing economy and world. So without further ado, I want to get into this topic of succession planning. And Tim, your background is fairly interesting, not just because of the extraordinary work that you do and have done, and your career has spanned over 50 years, and you've worked in at least 50 countries. You have an extraordinary experience. So I want to start off by hearing from you about how leadership has evolved from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Jesse. I have been remarkably fortunate in the time in which I had my professional career, starting out actually in 1971. And it has been an extraordinary 50 years in total, in which, as you all know, the world has changed in ways beyond recognition, and continues to do so. In that original environment, when I got my basic grounding, in working with major consumer goods companies in marketing, and then with McKinsey, as a partner at McKinsey in the early 80s, we were living in a very stable and relatively predictable world. This was a world when people really had long-range plans, 5-year plans, and it made sense because the environment was very stable in that time. And that began to change, I would say, with the internet, the late 90s, the emergence of the technology revolution. And really since the early 2000s, we've all been living in what the US military, I think, originally coined the phrase of VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in a VUCA world, you simply can't think about leadership in terms of running a stable system over time. I mean, obviously, you've all lived through this shift in the environment, and the change around it is really accelerating. The frequency of disruption that has been, unpredictable. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but those that are now the Gen Z that have been brought up in this environment and beginning to come into the workforce in significant numbers, they have grown up in a pretty dystopian world. So we have intergenerational value differences that are very, very significant. And so the old way in which a leader would think about leading was really based on a paradigm of evolutionary change and predictable results. And all of that is more or less completely out the window in reality. A lot of the we have to accept now that stability is fleeting as leaders. Change often involves looking at shifting the whole paradigm of an organization. And, if we go back to, some of the great thinkers of the past, and we talk about culture eating strategy for breakfast, it's sometimes not defining the strategy that is the challenge. It's the fact that the shift that is requires a dramatic shift in the organizational culture. And people don't like those kinds of changes. So I think as a leader, leaders have to be able to live with a foot in today and a foot in tomorrow, or put another way, they have to drive the performance engine for this year while simultaneously leading journeys of transformation. Now, I could say a lot more about that, Jesse, but that's just a sort of a starter.
Well, so let's add to that. So leadership has changed. Leadership is evolving. People are changing. Let's add to that the complexity of the last few years, right? So a global pandemic, which has disrupted so much. Then you have a reawakening around systemic racism, yes. Increasing polarization, a very, very combative climate. We seem not to have the patience for each other. And surprisingly, after the loss of so many people, yeah. Their mental health crisis, World Health Organization has identified mental health and burnout as a serious issue. And so has the CDC and a number of other organizations. And with that, Deloitte had a recent study that indicated about 70% of C-suite executives are looking for positions, are interested or open to resigning their positions for other roles that are less stressful. So you have all these layers of complexity, and leaders are asked to show up.
Yep.
They're managing their own responsibilities at home, in the workplace, in the marketplace, in their communities, in their church places or places of worship.
I think that's right, Jesse. And, just from, I'm still pretty connected with a lot of leaders or emergent leaders in their 30s and 40s. And I do think that the stresses and strains upon them feel radically different to those that I experienced at a similar stage in my career. That, I think partly because aspirations are greater. People on paper have many more options, although in practice they don't necessarily have all those options. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more social media impact on expectations, some of which are not necessarily realistic. And then you take the work-life balance, mental health issues that you're talking about. I think it's incredibly tough to be a young leader today.
So you have a lot of leaders who are either calling it quits or looking for roles that are less stressful. I'm not sure if that's even possible, given all that we've just talked about.
No, I don't. Well, I mean, people can obviously make different choices about, what is their purpose and what really their priorities are. I was thinking a little bit, Jesse, about, my own journey and thoughts about, why aren't we better at developing, why do so many leaders arrive at a leadership moment and then not feel prepared for the task at hand? And part of what I reflect on is that I think we still have something of an escalator mentality with regard to how you get to the top. You you develop expertise in an area, you go up the first rung on the ladder, the second rung on the ladder, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you go back actually to the times of Jack Welch, who at one time was an icon, I'm not sure if he's still viewed as an icon, given that GE hasn't, sustained its position. But I think that one of the things that he and his leadership guru, you may know the name, or maybe you have to be old like me, Noel Tichy, and they were really, really clear that developing leaders had to be a very conscious process.
Yes. Yes.
And that included thinking about assignments for leaders that really stretched them. And part of the development process was to take people out of their expert zone, place them in a completely different crucible experience. And that's a term that I would come back to, where they were tested, the organization could take the risk that they could fail, but they would grow exponentially, because instead of being on this escalator, they'd moved sideways laterally. They had an experience that was completely different in terms of its leadership characteristics. And out of that, they would develop their own convictions, what they called a teachable point of view. Mm. And I do think when I reflect back on my own personal experience, I mean, you mentioned, I think I worked in 7 industries. You learned at McKinsey that problem solving was a transferable expertise, and I worked in many different countries. There were lots of disappointments along the way. There were some failures, right? And there were some successes. And so you become, as in the crucible, it's a sort of refiner's fire analogy, that you become battle hardened. You also become a little more humble. You become less reliant upon a specific expertise and more upon a series of characteristics as a leader, which you can then apply if you really understand how to build and lead a team. And that you and I've spoken about that before, but I don't see leadership as a soloist role. If it ever was, it certainly isn't now.
So you mentioned a number of very important points there. So yes, leadership has changed, but a lot of leaders don't feel adequately prepared for their roles. And in that case, there are a number of studies, Gallup, Gartner, SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management. There are a number of studies about organizations and their management teams that don't feel adequately prepared for their roles. But there's a study that Google did. It's called Project Oxygen, or Oxygen Project, which I refer to in my trainings all of the time. And of the 8 to 10 characteristics or attributes that they thought leaders needed to be successful, subject matter expertise was the very last one.
Well, I agree with that, to be honest. It's actually what Donald Miller, who is the co-founder of an organization called StoryBrand, describes as the curse of knowledge.
Yes.
And I think obviously expertise is really important. But expertise is an essential prerequisite at certain levels in an organization. And so as a leader, you need to know what expertise is required, how to create the conditions that harness that. But if you're too close and you believe that just knowing whatever it is intensely is the key to success, I think you're very unlikely to be able to ride the waves of change and disruption, especially when they're unpredictable. Because then you're suddenly called into environments where you need a completely different set of skills. Mm. And actually you're sort of glued to the ground by your knowledge and expertise.
you're glued to the ground by your knowledge and expertise is because it's a safe place. That's where you've been successful, right? Your functional expertise, your subject matter expertise is where you've been successful. And so when we're talking about succession planning and preparing the next generation of leaders or leaders for promotional opportunities, or it could be successors, we got to really think about those leadership qualities, right?
Right.
Are necessary to be successful. And in one of the articles, this is Reinvent Your Business Before It's Too Late, I believe is the article. You talk about the S curve.
Right.
And if you can explain the S curve and then talk about some of the elements of not just being successful as an organization, as a business, but how do you tap into the talent of the organization as part of that three-pronged strategy?
Well, the origins of our thinking around the S-curve, which was the subject of a book that I co-authored with someone who worked with me at Accenture called Paul Nunes, was that, and I felt this very keenly, Andersen Consulting, which split off from Arthur Andersen, 1999. We decided to go public, transform the organization model, rebrand as Accenture. And in thinking about the positioning for Accenture, someone came up with the notion of high performance delivered. Now, that was, as preachers would say, we were catechizing against an opponent that strategy is all about the McKinsey Blue Book.
Mm-hmm.
And we couldn't possibly match McKinsey in terms of pure strategic work.
Mm-hmm.
So how would we differentiate? We would differentiate by saying, actually, it's great having a blue book, but if you can't execute, then the blue book is worthless. And I hope my former colleagues at McKinsey, when they hear me saying this, won't be too upset. So we set out to try and say, we know how to deliver. But then we had to define high performance. And at that time, there was a prevailing, Michael Porter was the big guru on competitive strategy. And it was all about finding the right sector and place to compete in based on industry dynamics and a whole variety of other things. We went out and researched, and we found that there were some really successful companies in apparently dog industries. And that, in fact, in almost every industry, you could see a leader who, for some reason, was distinguished from the others in the pack, even if they were in a bad industry. And that led us to three insights. Really, first of all, that those companies had really dedicated themselves to understanding what was happening to the basis of competition in their industries. How was that changing? And they had very deliberately attempted to cultivate foresight. Then they also were very conscious that when you have capabilities, they date. If you have leading capabilities, others catch up very quickly. So how do you keep advancing your capability agenda? And then finally, they were exceptional in their commitment to people and developing leaders. So those were the three key characteristics. But I think in reality, what we saw above all else was that good leaders understood that companies were never stable. We go back to the stability issue. So the S curve, like human beings, we get born, we grow, we become adults, and eventually we decline and we die. And organizations go through the same S curve, as it were. And the characteristics of leadership at every stage needs to change. So, we have the entrepreneur at the beginning, then we have a pathology where a lot of organizations never get to the next level because they can't systematize. The entrepreneur is incapable of integrating with system thinking. For most organizations, historically, they would stay in what we call the norm phase, which is the organization as machine, for decades, historically. And then maybe eventually you'd start to see it age, and you would have to reinvent the organization. And that's what we call the transform. So it's sort of form, storm, norm, transform. What's happening now is that we're living in transform almost all the time.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to shift paradigms. And that requires a foot in continuing to deliver the results that your shareholders or stakeholders expect today, whilst inventing something completely new. That's a wholly different management challenge. And so as we think about how do you develop leaders that can do that, my experience is if you don't bring in voices from the edge, right, who are outside the core, you will never do it. Because innovation is, I mean, yes, you have your Elon Musks and a few others, but for the most part, innovation doesn't start at the center. It starts on the edge.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up Elon Musk. I have my personal opinion about how he's managed all that, but I will leave that for another session. Which you can tell from my facial expression. There's much not much to be desired in terms of his leadership approach to all of this. But so when you're preparing leaders in a very evolving environment, you're also trying to create some level of stability. What does leadership development look like, especially as you're trying to fill critical positions, as you're trying to build successors? What does that look like from your vantage point?
You know, that's a very difficult question, I think, because, you know, a lot of organizations today, when they start to get into trouble, then one of the common phenomenon is overhead starvation. And the things that get cut are things like leadership development.
Yeah.
But in principle, I would say that there's a phase which is, you know, from individual contributor up towards manager. And that is one kind of challenge. And then there's the manager to leader, and then the leader to super leader. And the way in which people need to be developed at those different stages is probably different. So, you know, at World Relief, we use Gallup and its processes for bringing people up to manager. We developed our own leadership development model for the more senior leaders. We created our own evaluation and 360 process, you know, really pulling in on expertise from multiple different sources and integrating that for the particular organization and mission that we had. And interestingly, as we launched that, we actually started the first 360s that were done on me and my co-leader, the president, Scott Arbeiter. And then we cascaded that down through the executive committee, and then we cascaded it down a layer below that. And I think it's the conversations around that. And I mean, leadership development, some of it you can structure in training, but an awful lot of it is mentoring. And you know, again, coming back to the challenges that face leaders today, you know, it's culture shaping, it's making sure you have the right team. I think trust is the single most important coin of the realm. And that requires you to be present in a lot of different places, not least with, you know, as much of your leadership team as you can be present with.
So some studies show that leaders say that they do not have adequate time to mentor, to coach, to expose their team members to other opportunities to help them stretch and expand their own expertise and capabilities. What do you say to that?
I deeply appreciate that point of view. my response to that, and this is purely through lived experience, is that given the demands today, organizations should be more and more moving to co-leadership models.
So, and I've seen one of your posts about co-leadership. Can you explain co-leadership a little bit more?
Yeah. So, you know, since I've just come out of a Christian nonprofit, I will stick in the faith tradition to give you a very simple insight. In the environment that we're talking about, where you need to nurture and care your people, and you need to be very thoughtful about where your different stakeholders are coming from, and you know, the different complex agendas that you mentioned at the beginning. When you want to help people through the dark nights, it's good to have a priest. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, priests very rarely are prophetic. So you probably want a prophet as well, right? And you know, most prophets die at some point, right? Because what they're saying is not particularly welcome. So in an incredibly oversimplified analogy, organizations need at the top some combination of perspective, gifting, that can be both priestly and prophetic. And you're not going to find that. You don't find those two qualities in a single individual. So actually what you probably want to build is a partnership of two, could be a partnership of three. It's not as simple as saying I have a CEO and a COO, because it's not about the structure. It's about the gifts, and then how you divide those gifts in paying attention to the different stakeholders. So
your analogy was really for the higher level
yes,
organizational leadership roles. But if we're talking about someone at the C-suite level or below that management level, does the co-leadership model work?
Well, what I've read about other people's thinking on co-leadership models is you know, they're often not formalized as such, but they work that way in practice. So when we were creating Accenture Interactive, which, you know, we saw the digital disruption on the horizon back in 2003-04. And this was way outside Accenture's, you know, normative sphere of work. We went out and acquired a couple of relatively small early stage digital companies. And I, working with their leaders, helped create the vision for what is now Accenture Interactive, which is a, you know, $12 or $13 billion organization in and of itself. That was a co-leadership model, because I didn't have the expertise. These guys were much younger than me. They were brilliant. Part of my role was to protect them, nurture them, you know, because one of the things that happens with innovation often is people start to see something taking off and they want to get on board with it. So they had to be also sheltered and protected until it reached a certain critical mass. So that's an example of an informal co-leadership model, and I would think that should happen in many places.
Okay, so one of the, in preparing for this interview, we talked about your experience at Accenture as you were moving on from Accenture, and that succession planning experience that you had. Could you just walk us through that experience and what was going through your head, and what were the cues that it was time for you to move on from that role?
Well, you know, I think it's often an amalgam of different considerations, some personal, some professional for the organization. And it certainly was all of those things when, you know, I was looking to move on. But one of the one of the things that we did, so I've talked about Accenture Interactive, which the vision was, you know, the very earliest stage of the S-curve, the initial formation. That was 2004-05. It wasn't called Accenture Interactive at that stage. It was just a group of organizations, small internal departments that were working together towards developing something that, you know, would become a powerful entity. I think by about 2008, we could see that this had a lot of potential and that we had a lot of the ingredients, but we didn't have all the capability internally. So we very deliberately went to the outside to find a number of people who had direct experience in the advertising industry, because really what we were trying to create on the back of the digital revolution was an offering that spanned both really consulting, technology, and marketing and advertising. That was the vision, that all the existing incumbents were good at one part, but no one else could integrate them. So I went out, we found a couple of people who we thought really had the potential to grow. One of whom actually had a prior experience in consulting, but had then gone on to have senior leadership in advertising industry. And I brought him on board as sort of, again, probably, you know, one of the top 2 or 3 people, whether it formally was structured that way. And by 2011, we had created the organization formally. We'd gone out into the marketplace, we were making waves, and the organization was really beginning to make real growth strides. It was very clear to me that the individual that I had brought in, he was ready to step up. And I think had we not taken the move then or shortly thereafter, he would probably have been poached to go elsewhere. And so it was a combination of pragmatic considerations, personal considerations, and frankly, a sense of obligation to him, because he took a risk coming into the organization when I first approached him. And he led the organization for best part of a decade, very successfully.
I want to ask you a question here about bringing folks from the outside, especially when you're looking to fill such a critical role. You were Chief Strategy Officer at the time, right?
Yes.
So, bringing folks from the outside can be great. You have someone with a different perspective who could probably add some value, but then you also have candidates internally who have the institutional knowledge, the experience, expertise to also lead. Can you talk about culture and the pros and cons about internal candidates versus external candidates, and why culture is such an important thing to monitor at that time?
Well, I mean, I would have a preference generally for internal candidates. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the starting point. But when you're looking at, you know, really pivotal jobs, I think you have to go for best candidates, and, you know, therefore an open application process may make sense. Again, that's a culture issue as much as anything. But, you know, I think particularly these days, that makes a lot of sense to me. But ideally, if you're bringing people in from the outside, in an ideal world, my view is you would give them time to get their training wheels and prove themselves before they absolutely move into the top slot. Because that gives everybody a chance. It's sort of like almost leadership in waiting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that would just be my preference. But there is a case, particularly when you're going through a very, you know, the organization needs to be disrupted. Then there really is a case for going outside. And I think all the time, Jesse, I've always looked at, and I think you've heard me talk about Lencioni's work on the 6 geniuses of a team. I think you have to look at the strategic situation, and you need to look at the team dynamics and what you believe the challenge ahead is. And then in that context, you make that decision. But there should be a home turf advantage for an inside player, because the knowledge of the culture and just that sense of ideally real commitment and history with the organization, that's an important asset.
And then, so as you were deciding to move on from your role at Accenture, what were the signals for you personally that it was time to move on?
I think actually, honestly, a feeling that there was a successor who would bring skills and energy, and who would preserve the direction, understood the journey we'd been on, understood the direction. I didn't see it as likely to lead to, a left turn or a right turn. So he was someone that, we'd been in the trenches together, and, so I could trust that he understood. And we didn't agree on everything. You never will. When someone takes over, they change some things. But on the big things, we did agree. For me, it was a different stage of life. And I wanted to sort of give back a little bit to society, which then led into the following decade of doing a lot of work around Christian leadership development, and then ultimately world relief.
So, and then your time at World Relief, you were on the board at World Relief, and then you were asked to step into the CEO role. You did tremendous turnaround transformation work with the organization, as is really your pattern. And so what you do now as a strategic advisor, what were the signals for you that it was time to move on from World Relief?
Jesse, old age.
Okay.
Although I'm not someone that retires easily.
Yes.
It has to be said. But we went through a very difficult time. It's a wonderful organization, and it's had some, great leaders over time. The particular crisis that led to, my coming in was, and I came in incidentally as a co-leader with the then president and CEO. And in essence, he chose to have his job divided. And I had been working with him in a supporting function. He's gone on to be very successful elsewhere. So we evolved that partnership. And it was a very challenging time, because the organization, about half of what it did was US refugee resettlement. The other half was international development. And we all know what happened with refugee resettlement, from 2016 onwards. It was decimated.
Yeah.
And so the economic pressures were really intense, but the organization has a great history, wonderfully committed people all over the world, very easy to be inspired by, but like many nonprofits, a fragile economic model. So really, that was the core of my initial focus, was making sure that the economic model was sustainable. And I obviously had to learn the industry from scratch, which goes back again to the lack of expertise. If you have a searching mind and know how to ask questions, and you're open to learning, you can learn the industry. So I was in total, it was almost 6 years. It was a shared leadership model throughout. Honestly, the words in that time, it was just a tumultuous period, and we got to a place of stability, and we could see that we were getting to a place of stability, that we'd sort of survived the crisis. And it was time then for someone to take the organization forward for the next, who knows, 7 years. I mean, I'm generally not in favor of 15 or 20-year tenures, but equally 3-year tenures are not great either. You know, I think an ideal tenure is probably, you know, 6 to 8, 6 to 9 years, and then you need fresh blood.
Mm-hmm. So as we begin to wrap up the interview and go into the Q&A portion, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat. If you prefer to ask your question, please just raise your virtual hand and I will get to you. And as we transition into this aspect of the interview, I wanted to ask what your nuggets of wisdom or lessons learned that you would want to share with the participants today about preparing the next generation of leaders, or the next leaders who will either assume their roles or are looking to move into leadership roles. What nuggets of wisdom or lessons learned would you share?
You asking me that, Jesse?
Yes, asking you that.
Well, the 4 things I think that a leader needs to have. I think they need clarity, courage, compassion. I'd probably add conviction in there. Mm-hmm. General Mattis, who wrote a wonderful book called Codename Chaos, says attitude is caught, not taught. Mm-hmm. And so as I think about preparing leaders, I think, and this is more the senior cadre, but I also think it can apply at middle levels for sure. I think personal mentorship really, really matters. I think giving people tools for skill building. I think multiple models, as you know, for heightening one's sense of self-awareness and other awareness. So the whole EQ side of the equation, the higher you go, the more important the EQ is versus the IQ. And there are lots of different tools out there that I've been exposed to that at the right time and the right way, I think bringing those to the party and honestly, making this space, whatever your economics, to be able to do that.
Well, and then there are 2 aspects of succession planning that I want to highlight. Again, if you have questions, feel free to type in the chat. If you want to ask the question live, feel free to just raise your virtual hand or just wave at me. But there's the incumbent or the person leaving the role, whether they're moving on to another position, moving on to another organization, or retiring. And then there's the person taking on that role or other roles in the organization. And I think for me, having been in that position where I came in to do a job, one of the things that I've learned in moving on is that who I am is not tied to that title or position. That position is not the measure of who I am. It's the measure of what I was able to do in that season of my life. And so I think one of the things that leaders have to do is divorce themselves from their title and position, so that role doesn't become their identity.
Yes.
And it's not the ceiling for who you are. It's just an expression of your ability, right? And so just moving on is, okay, I've done what I can, and now I need to invest in, or I have been investing in others on my team and in the organization to take on this role if they so choose.
Really, I think, Jesse, as you get older, it becomes obvious the purpose has to be the next generation.
Yes. Yeah.
They're the ones that are going to inherit the world. And, you know, we maybe made a little bit more of a mess of it than we originally thought with our baby boomer optimism. So we really owe it to them to, A, step aside in a timely basis when the time is right, and B, to prepare them for taking it over and getting it to a better place.
Yes, and whether you're retiring or moving on to another role, you're passing on the baton of leadership. And you touched on something which is really the essential point of this conversation is legacy. Your greatest legacy is what you are able to pass on in people and through people, and taking the time. And that's what it requires. It just takes setting aside time to coach and mentor. And some of the tips I would share, and Chris, I see your hand, so I'll get to you. One of the things that I always do, and I think I learned this after one of my mentors shared with me a hard truth, because I wanted people to pour into me. And he's like, as a leader, you have to pour into yourself. And people don't have that much time to think about you. In fact, they're not. And so if you want to grow, you have to invest in yourself. But the best measure of what you're able to do in your role is how the other people on your team are able to lead with and without you.
Yeah,
And
Jess,
yes,
just very quickly, and this is a slight angle to what you just said, but I think it bears on it as well. You know, we often think about leadership in terms of power, right? Because there is power and authority. But good leaders recognize that the source of their power is other people,
yes,
and the focus of their power is other people. And, you know, sadly, that's a lesson that many leaders still haven't fully grasped. And it's a hard lesson to take someone mid-career and shift them if you haven't begun to work on that when people are in their 30s or early 40s.
and that's why through the Leadership at Work series, we do that early on. And if you're already in your leadership position and you haven't had that type of training and development, we help you make that shift. Because if people in these leadership roles don't understand that leadership is about other people, you'll hold on to a role, you'll hold on to the position, not developing other people, not taking the time to understand where they want to go and how they want to grow, and making that concerted effort to help them get there. And I always believe we have to be partners in our success stories. So you have the opportunity really to do something amazing, which is position someone else for success that will change the trajectory of their lives in so many ways. So I want to take Chris' question before we keep going on. Chris, thank you so much for joining.
Sure.
Thank you for your question.
This has been excellent. I've taken so much notes from both of you so far. I really appreciate it. I guess, Tim, my question would be for you. So specifically about women and leadership and getting there, and some of the stereotypical things that we might consider about a woman who is in leadership, or someone with a lot of ambition. When you reflect on women who were successful in climbing that leadership ladder, I'm wondering if there's anything that you picked up that you could share that you thought might have helped them, specifically women.
Well, I mean, it's still really, really hard. For it's not a level playing field. You know, despite people's best efforts. Partly, I think, because many of the cultures, hard as we try on, you know, the whole DE&I agenda, are essentially led by people who have grown up in patriarchal value systems. And so there's an unconscious bias, even when there is a desire to, you know, have all the gifts of women and men leading together come together. Now, I have seen incredibly good, successful women in leadership positions, including in CEO positions. And really, they're just good because they're good, right? And I've seen, and it's not like, you know, feminine characteristics, EQ versus male characteristics. It's not. I mean, those things don't sit as neatly as, you know, perhaps one might stereotype them. What I have generally learned is that if you can create a team of female mentors, that mentoring woman to woman seems to be more successful on average than man to woman.
I would add, Chris, to that. I've benefited from a number of wonderful male leaders. Steve Grossman and Judge Leslie Harris are two that readily come to mind. And I would say, as a woman and a woman of color, one of the things that they did was give me the resources that I need, give me the platform, inviting me on their platform, and giving me credit very, very publicly for the work that I did, which helped me tremendously, because it wasn't me behind someone else. It was Jessie standing here, and she's more than capable, opening doors for a lot more women and women of color to be able to see themselves in these roles, very high profile roles, and to be successful. So I think the tooling, the resourcing, and the freedom to bring the creativity and the problem solving skills to the table, and appreciating that in a very public way was very, very important for me. Excellent question. Any other questions before we wrap up? And as we wrap up, Tim, I would ask you if you have any final words to share, but what I would share with the group is, whether you're moving on from your role or looking to retire, remember your position was just an expression of your ability in that season. It is not who you are, and it is not the limit of who you will be. There's so much more in you. And so your greatest legacy in that role is what you do in and through the people who remain and the successors who continue the work. So it is to your benefit to take the time to hear from them. Know, number one, if they are interested in taking on a more leadership role or a more senior role in your organization, taking the time to develop them and giving them experience to grow, to learn the organization, to learn the industry, and to decide whether or not it's time for them to move into that role. But make sure that your slate of candidates are diverse as possible, and don't always choose the same people because you think they have the stuff to be successful in that role. The reality is there are probably people in your organization who are looking for those opportunities but have been overlooked, whether it's because of their sex or their color, or because they don't have what we normally look for. Take the time to dig deeper, work with your HR leadership or D&I leadership, if you have one, to build a team of people who can move into your role or other leadership roles in the organization. And as you move on to whatever your next season is, remember your legacy is what you do in and through other people and how you build them and how you live out your purpose for the betterment of all, right? I believe that leaders are here to solve other problems that affect people. That's what we're here to do. And that I think that's the greatest legacy that we have. Tim, I will leave the last word to you unless there's another question. And I don't see any right now.
Jesse, I couldn't say anything to better the close that you just gave. I agree 100% with that closing from you, and grateful for an opportunity here to speak into some of these topics. I guess I probably would say every time that you think you're approaching mastery on a topic, and then you get into a conversation like this and you realize, well, no, I've still got a distance to go. So thank you for that opportunity to be with you all, and I really appreciate it.
For you to say that is probably the most humbling thing I've heard probably all year. Thank you so much. So if you're interested in the Leadership at Work series and you want to bring that to your organization, you can email info@stcyrconsulting.com or visit the website stcyrconsulting.com, and you can get a full description of the series for leaders, for D&I, and for the compliance aspect of leadership as well. Thank you all for joining. This is the last session of the year. We will be on a break for the holidays. And I thank you all for bearing with me. I've actually been sick this entire time, but I think I made it through without coughing. So super excited. Thank you again for joining. Look out for an email with additional information about the recording and additional resources that will be coming your way. Thank you again.